Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity 2022. We'd like to kick off the Ukraine crisis and politics of the great powers, the role of the United Nations for international peace, and the future of multilateralism session. Please kindly turn your cell phone on vibration mode, and this event is currently being simultaneously translated. Those who want the translation services, please wear a receiver placed in front of your seat. You can use channel number 1 for Korean and 2 for English. Let me introduce our moderator for this session to you. The moderator for this session is Mr. Hyun In-taek, former Minister of Unification. He is a professor emeritus of Korea University and also the chair of the International Policy Studies Institute. He served as the 35th Unification Minister and also a special advisor to the President for the Unification Policy, North Korean nuclear issues, unification of the Korean Peninsula, and international relations in East Asia are his main research area. With that, let me hand over to the moderator.
As introduced, my name is Hyun In-taek. I am Professor Emeritus of Korea University. I'm very delighted to chair this very important session in my hometown, Jeju Island. I attended middle and high school here, so it's really happy to be here. This session is hosted by two important organizations, Korea Academic Council on the United Nations System and the Jeju Peace Institute. So I'm very happy to thank both organizations, especially presidents of KCON's Professor Shin-Hwa Lee and President of Jeju Peace Institute, Dr. Han In-taek. The topic that we are going to deal with today has very important meanings and implications, both theoretically and empirically, in many important international issues. Organizers gave us 4 important questions to deal with today. Number 1, what can multilateralism do for Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Number 2, especially, is the UN mechanism still valid? Number 3, how can we deal with the heated power politics of great powers such as the United States, Russia, and China, especially between different political systems? For instance, democracy and authoritarianism, between liberalism and non-liberalism. Number 4, how does the international society cooperate for the so-called emerging security issues, especially food security, energy security, and migration? If I add one more, what should the United States, Japan, and South Korea do for this situation? So we will deal with these all very important, eminent, theoretical, empirical questions today. I want to introduce today's speakers. We have very eminent scholars here, eminent specialist experts here today. We have 3 very important speakers today. They are all presidents of Academic Council on the United Nations System. From the US, we have Liz Howard, president of ACONS, Academic Council on the United Nations System. I can see his face, but I'm sure that she's here with us. We have Ambassador Shinyo Takahiro from Japan. He is president of Japan Academic Council on the United Nations System. And he was ambassador to Germany. We have, as I introduced, Professor Shinhwa Lee, president of Korea Academic Council on the United Nations System. And she is currently appointed as ambassador for international cooperation on North Korean human rights by President Yoon. We have 5 very eminent scholars to discuss, today's issues. Number 1, we have Professor Kim Min Han of Ewha Women's University. We have Baek Woo-yeol of Yonsei University, is sitting in the center. We have Dr. Im Hae-ryong of Jeju Peace Foundation. We have Mason Rich of Hankuk University. Mason, okay. And finally, we have Choi Eun-mi of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Today, a little bit unfortunately, we have a very strict time limitations. 80 minutes is allowed it. I spent already, some minutes. So I want to give speakers for about 15 minutes for their presentation. And I want to give discussions for about 5 minutes for their discussions. So after discussions, we're going to have a Q&A session for about 10 to 15 minutes if time will be allowed. Okay, so I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Howard. Okay, she's still, connecting the internet. So instead, I want to give Dr. Ambassador Shinyo to present his presentation. Ambassador Shinyo.
You can see her. So she's ready and she's able to speak.
Okay.
Why don't you start?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Ambassador Shinyo. Are we all here and can you hear me? I would love to have some feedback.
Ambassador Shinyo, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Should I start?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to talk about the, how the world is right now. As you rightly know, that the world is more and more divided into several groups, and also it is the confrontation between the values or confrontation between the geopolitical settings. And those values, of course, very important, elements for the, the vision of the world. But this is the, whether democracy or not, or whether freedom is, guaranteed or not, and those values Well, besides that, I would like to see a clear, division between the G7 on one side and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on the other, or between G7 and BRICS. Those kind of the confrontation or competition could be seen. And I think normally the organization like United Nations or G20s must function very well in order to bridge over those differences. But those multilateral organizations are pretty weak or very weak nowadays. And I think in this age, what is more important is to guarantee the fundamental values which is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The Article 1 and Paragraph 3 says that the fundamental freedom and human rights are the very important missions of the United Nations. So I think this must be guarantees. And I would like to say that the Washington Post, a little bit 2 years ago, but says a very interesting, writes an interesting article. It says that the United States is not taking the leadership. Europe is busy with itself, and China is doing selfish actions from beginning to end. And the Security Council is not only not functioning, but it is also no longer fit for purpose. And, that's very interesting and still valid. The Ukrainian war has clearly demonstrated that the world is in such an anarchic situation. Well, having said this, I would like to, point out what the United Nations must do and how can we, strengthen the United Nations. Well, many people say that the United Nations is not functioning well, but I don't think so. The United Nations Security Council is not functioning, but the other organizations, other institutions are working very well. And so that we have to make differences between those, institutions. The United Nations is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is the United Nations which is composed of member states. The second phase is the neutrality that is embodied in the Secretariat. So the second phase is Secretariat. And the third phase of the United Nations is the implementation organizations, such as UNICEF or UNHCR and so on. They are working very hard, even in a very difficult situation. So that we should clearly make a difference which kind of which kind of part of the United Nations is not functioning. The malfunctioning, functioning very little is the Security Council. We have to make it clear. And so what shall we do? We should not depend too much on the big powers or P5s. If you rely on the big powers, P5s, then I think you will have more divisions. You will have more dysfunctioning of the United Nations Security Council or United Nations itself. So that what we should do is to collect powers from among the middle powers or middling powers or smaller powers to unite those powers to make the United Nations, the effective. Well, I think for that purpose, maybe I think Japan, Korea, or other, ACT groups, Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency Group, headed by Switzerland. And I think those groups, and also there are also the group of Alliance for Multilateralism, which is composed of some 60 or 65 countries. And those countries must, work together. For what purpose? First of all, I think we should work for the improvement of the use of veto rights in the Security Council. We should do more. Liechtenstein, a very small country, has done a good job. in the General Assembly. Everything must be done in General Assembly because there is no veto right. We should perhaps work together to make other or another resolutions. For example, to prohibit the use of veto for the genocide case or the crime against humanity. Or we should perhaps make it very clear that Article 27, paragraph 3 of the United Nations Charter, that a country which is involved in the confrontation must abstain from the voting in the Security Council. This is clearly stipulated, but it is not exercised as it is stipulated. Well, regarding the Security Council reform itself, I would like to say that the possibility of to increase the number of permanent members is extremely limited. It can be said that there is almost no possibility of reforming the Security Council with this idea. Therefore, without adhering to the expansion of the number of the permanent members, we should create 6 to 8 semi-permanent members or non-permanent members with longer term of 4 to 8 years. Re-election is also possible, which have a strong will to contribute to international peace and security from among middle power countries, including Japan, Korea, or other countries. Recently, I think Turkey is very, very active on this issue. Well, now, the next point is the promotion of the disarmament. We should not forget that this is a very important issue in multilateral settings. Well, we are witnessing that the nuclear armaments is increasing, and the confrontation is also advancing. And we have the news that China is increasing from its nuclear warheads from 300 to 1,000. Or we have the North Korean nuclear program issues. Ukrainian war demonstrated that there was a clear threat of the use of nuclear weapons, or even we have seen the attack against the nuclear power plants, which is clearly against the international law. Well, and also we have the failure in August of the NPT review conference. No document was produced at all because of because of one country. And so that we should perhaps overcome those difficulties, and we should need a forum to discuss those issues. If NPT is not the right place to discuss this issue, or if the TPNW, Treaty on Prohibition of the Nuclear Weapons, is not the right place to issue, then we should utilize the General Assembly. And General Assembly had in the past, already 3 times the special session devoted on disarmament. But it was only, the last meeting of this was 1988, long time ago. Now I think it is time for us to have another 4th General Assembly devoted on disarmament affairs, and we should together, propose this idea. Japanese government will be perhaps, discussing the issue of the nuclear disarmament by the G7 summit to be held in Hiroshima next year. I hope that this could be a breakthrough. Number 4, Secretary General plays also an important role to, level up or upgrade the United Nations. I would like to ask Secretary General to play more important role and more active role to make the United Nations more valid. And Mr. Guterres has issued his report, namely our common agenda, in September last year, and he proposed to draft a new agenda for peace. That's fine. It was Mr. Boutros Ghali who wrote the agenda for peace immediately after the end of demise of the Cold War. Now it is time for Mr. Guterres to really work out his new agenda for peace. And in this program, he must propose so many things. He would like to propose, maybe he should propose the reform of the organizations and also how to overcome the confrontation, and how to nurture multilateralism, and so on and so forth in the concrete terms. Next point is how should we promote multilateralism? Well, I think it is very sad to say that nowadays I think the number of the countries of democracies are less than the number of the countries of non-democracy. Well, according to the Swedish organization, I think the number of the democratic countries about 87, and the non-democratic countries number is 93. So it is far more than the differences. So we should avoid the confrontation whether countries is democratic country or non-democratic country, because the reason why is that there is a freedom to choose a political system. So democracy is one of those systems. We are not able to say that democracy is the best one. There is absolute freedom, for member countries, sovereign countries to choose which political system they would like to prefer. And also, when you look at the Charter of the United Nations, there is no word of democracy. Very interesting. There is no mentioning about democracy, because it is very clear that the United Nations consists of so many different countries based on the political system. That was the reason why. So I think the democracy or non-democracy, should not be the demarcation line between the countries. So what we should promote is fundamental freedom and the human rights. If every type of the political system is able to guarantee those two, as stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations, that's perfect. And we need more cooperation also from among the middle power countries, the smaller countries, and then I think Japan, Korea, and also some other countries from East Asia or Africa or other regions, Middle East and South America. Of course, we should perhaps work together for that purpose. My last point is how to avoid war in the Asia-Pacific region. After having seen what happened in Ukraine, I think it is a rather real, the things that we should envisage. We can envisage. In order to prevent the war to break out in the Indo-Pacific region or East Asian countries, we need the summit meeting of the whole Asian countries plus United States, China, Russia. All those big powers must be involved, and we should sign the document. Legally binding document to guarantee the status quo, and also to guarantee the principle that the status quo shall not be changed with the use by the use of force, and also the confidence building measures and promotion of human rights. Those must be guaranteed legally, as it was the case in 1975, just in the time of the Cold War, that the European countries, all European countries plus United States and Canada, 35 countries from East and West, gathered in Helsinki and signed the document of Helsinki Final Act. It was 75, and then it preserved peace in Europe till the end of the Cold War, till the demise of the Cold War. So we need to, work very hard on this, and maybe I think we have already forum. ASEAN Region Forum or so. Maybe I think this could be the basis upon which we are able to work that kind of legally binding document, not declaration, not blah, 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 legally binding documents. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Shinyo. Exactly the time. Your time punctuality is very good. I don't want to repeat or summarize what Ambassador Shinyo said in his presentation, but I think his last point is very, very important. Even though we have ASEAN Regional Forum or other mechanisms to solve the problems in this Indo-Pacific region. He said he tried to emphasize the creation of a new version, Asian version of security, multilateralism in this area. So I think it's a very important point. Dr. Howard is with us here. All right, are you ready? Hello?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You have 15 minutes.
I'm here.
All right, go ahead,
Great.
please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me here this evening here where I am in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Shinyo, it is always a pleasure to see you. I understand that Ambassador Shinyo is having trouble hearing me. Can the others hear me? If you could kindly turn up my sound, that would be helpful. Ambassador Shinyo, can you hear me? No. Okay, he needs a little bit more sound. And to our technical staff, if you could kindly put up my PowerPoint slides, I would very much appreciate it. Unless you would like me to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, thank you. Great. Thank you, everyone. So I think you've already heard my introduction. I'm sorry, I was having a bit of technical trouble before I came on today. We start this session with 4 questions that Ambassador Shinyo answered, and I have to say that I agree with him about many of his answers. I will take some of my answers in a slightly different direction, but I want to start by talking about reminding us all what multilateralism is. Talk a moment about the effectiveness of the UN Security Council. I have a cat who's not used to having me on a Zoom at night. I want to talk for a moment about liberalism and regime type and authoritarianism. And then the most pressing problems of today, international problems of today and their solutions, and then I'll conclude. And if you'll bear with me, I think my cat might be joining us for some of this. At least I don't have children here now. Kindly change the slide. Change, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so our first question is about what negative and positive effects will multilateralism have on will Russia's invasion of Ukraine have on multilateralism? And just to remind us, multilateralism, the basic definition from John Ruggie, it's an institutional form that coordinates relations among 3 or more states. So it's 3 or more states based on the basis of generalized principles of conduct and rules. So based on norms, rules, and institutions. Here in the United States, the word multilateralism does not have the best reputation. Americans don't like words that tend not to like words, I should say. Not all Americans, but there is a tendency not to like words that have 7 syllables. And Madeleine Albright, may she rest in peace, she would sometimes say that multilateralism is a terrible word. It's hard to say, it's hard for Americans to pronounce, it's hard for everybody to pronounce. But really what it means is partnership. It means countries working together. And at the end of the day, what I just said is that it's about countries working together. Multilateralism is state-based, which means it requires states to recognize each other's sovereignty, right? So at its foundations, multilateralism is about recognizing sovereignty and sovereign relations among states. Russia's invasion of Ukraine undermines the basic principle of multilateralism, which is sovereignty. It undermines our concept of sovereignty, which of course means that it's having a decidedly negative impact on multilateralism. China and Russia have, as we all know, as primary components of their foreign policies, the upholding of sovereignty and non-intervention. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine violates both of those principles. We all know that Ukraine, of course, has been a voting member of the United Nations since its birth, because Stalin wanted Ukraine and Belarus to have voting rights in the General Assembly. So in some ways, Ukrainian sovereignty has been recognized by the rest of the world for a very long time. It's not only since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thank you for changing slides. On the next question of the effectiveness of the UN Security Council and questions of war and peace, international law, especially when it comes to war and peace, is based on a distinction between war between states as opposed to civil wars. So we have law that looks at wars between states, and then we have international law that thinks more about the rights of civilians in civil wars. The problem is that we have a rise of a different phenomenon, which is civil wars that have external actors fighting them in them, of internationalized civil wars. This phenomenon, this rising phenomenon of violent conflict, falls between the cracks of international law. We don't have good international law to deal with this phenomenon. I'll also note that the UN Security Council, on the question of civil wars, the Security Council has actually, and the UN has actually been quite effective at reducing civil wars through the mechanism of peacekeeping. I've spent quite a lot of my career studying peacekeeping, and we have overwhelming quantitative literature that shows that peacekeeping has been successful. It doesn't always seem like it's successful, but it has been quite a successful phenomenon. And yet we haven't had a new peacekeeping mission for the last 8 years. So even though this is a successful form of intervention, the UN has gotten very good at it, we haven't had this form of a new peacekeeping mission in the last 8 years. Now, if we could please move to the next slide, I just want to show a graph of war. So if we look at armed conflict by type since the end of World War II, we see in the gray, those are the colonial wars, and those ended. We see in the green the civil wars. And if we look at about the middle of the chart, we see a downward trend in civil wars, and that has been attributed to peacekeeping. In the orange, we see the rise of internationalized civil wars. So these are civil wars that have international actors intervening in them, sending their troops directly. So they're not proxy wars, they're civil wars that have troops from other states fighting directly in them. Think Syria, for example, or Libya, or Yemen. And now, if we look at the bottom line, we see interstate war, wars between states. So the dark gray line, I think, is the most striking line of this graph. And what it says to me is that the Security Council has been, and the UN system in general, has been remarkably successful at limiting wars between states since World War II. We've had about 50 times, 50 times, when militarized disputes between states. Every state in the world has a border dispute. I don't know of any states that don't have some that are free of all border disputes. Maybe you'll correct me on this point, but I think it's very few states don't have border disputes. And when there have been militarized border disputes, when those disputes have escalated to violence, 50 times since World War II, the UN Security Council has made a resolution on the conflict, and it's de-escalated. And we see that in this dark gray line here, that the UN Security Council has been regulating militarized disputes between states. And what this war, what this invasion of Ukraine means is that that dark gray line might be a thing of the past, that we might be returning to a world where we have wars between states. If we could turn to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. In the I only have a few more months, so I'm going to run through this quickly. Basically, what I want to say is that agreeing with Ambassador Shinyo, we have a lot of disputes about regime type. Democracy versus authoritarianism is mainly what it's coming down today. We see China abstaining on the three main General Assembly resolutions. So it's abstaining. In other words, its support of Russia is not necessarily limitless, even though we have that rhetoric. And its abstention means that China maybe doesn't entirely agree with Russian aggression toward its neighbor. And yet at the same time, China is also tacitly supporting this dramatic breach of sovereignty. And I think at the end of the day, that is based on differences in regime type, in who is friendly with whom. If we could turn to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we have these disputes over regime type, but at the end of the day, the gravest threats to humanity, climate change, pandemic disease, inequality, violent conflict, including nuclear war, wars between states, these can only be confronted when states act together. And we all know this, but I think it's worth reminding us all that multilateralism is a public good. It is something that is required of this age right now. War in Ukraine is threatening hunger in Africa. Europe might be cold this winter. In other words, the need for cooperation and partnership is existential. In my mind, there's actually nothing idealistic about it, because cooperation is in every state's national interest, even though we perceive regime type as being more important. At the end of the day, does it really matter if a country is democratic or authoritarian if we don't have a world to live in anymore? In other words, at the end of the day, cooperation is more important than regime type. Let's go to the last slide. This is some public opinion polling by the Open Society Foundation. And if you could move to the next one, please. Next slide. Thank you. I just wanted to note that a lot of countries in the world are not sure how to think about the war in Ukraine. This is a series of public opinion polling that basically show we live in a 50-50 world right now. We can move to the next slide also. People in countries across the world are divided, and they're basically unsure about how to think of the age we live in. It's very hard to predict where things will go from here. And so I think whether we're experts, we're the head of our professional associations, or we're average citizens of countries across the world, none of us can predict very accurately about where things will go next. The world hangs in the balance. Next slide, please. So to conclude, Russia's violation of Ukraine's borders undermines the sovereignty principle, and therefore it undermines the basic principles of multilateralism, of states working together. Interstate war had been a phenomenon of the past. It had been a phenomenon of history. It had been effectively regulated by the UN Security Council, and that regulation of war is in question right now. I'm not negating the importance of democracy. I believe fully in democracy, of freedoms, of the fundamental freedoms, and in human rights. Don't get me wrong. And at the same time, at the end of the day, I think the threats to humanity are even more important. Cooperation is not an idealistic goal. It's in every state's interest. And actually, individuals across the world recognize that in the public opinion polling. But my final question is, do the leaders of states recognize the importance of cooperation at this moment in history? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Howard. I think her presentation is very excellent and textured presentation, especially the conclusion that she made is very clear, concrete, and I think agreeable. The last point, especially, she made is quote-unquote, cooperation is not idealistic. It is in every state's interest, but to their leaders. In other words, she ended her presentation with another very important question. I think world politics has had a long journey to find a solution for this. But with this question, I think, unfortunately, we have to have another long journey to solve this question in the near future. So what should we do? What should we do? What can we do? Thank you very much, Professor Howard. Very excellent presentation. Then I would like to invite the third speaker, Professor Shinhwa Lee. Please do.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Professor and Minister Hyun. Well, let me start with saying that Korean Academic Council on the UN system was established in 1999, and which was joined by the Japanese Academic Council on the UN system. We call KCOUNS and JOUNS, was having a bilateral academic conference since 2001. So it's almost 23 years that we've been working together with the hope to increase the multilateralism, not only for the contributions to the global peace and security, but also through that we can improve our inter-state cooperation between Korea and Japan. In addition, China joined our endeavors to improving the multilateralism in 2011, so that these three countries making a so-called East Asian seminar to improve the spirit of the UN multilateralism and the beyond. But however, Howard was mentioning the Russian invasion of Ukraine undermined the sovereignty principle and therefore the multilateralism. But I think even before that, we start to have a lot of signs and symptoms of how the great power politics undermines the multilateralism. So I will just, in interest of time, I will just quickly read and also mentioning about what I just prepared. United States and China emphasize the significance of multilateral framework, but they have not departed from power politics. As the conflict and confrontation between US-initiated or Chinese style of multilateralism intensifies, the practice of multilateral cooperation based on openness and responsibility and cooperation is losing ground. Competition between great power has for decades threatened the authority and role of international organizations. Although Ambassador Shinho was talking about it's not all international United Nations organizations, depending on which kind of the UN organization we are talking about, but I still believe that as the US and China rivalry intensified, the United Nations organization, not only on the security arena, including Security Council, but also economic arena, trade, and the health pandemic more recently, and all those multilateral mechanisms are facing greater challenges. Some predicted that the US-China confrontation would soften under the US President Biden's coming to the power in 1.5 years ago. However, I don't think the way the Biden is engaging with China is still not departed from the very clear power politics. So, like for instance, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was talking about the U.S. relation with China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. I think his remark reflects the Biden administration's awareness of the very complex relation of the two great powers relations. Since then, the catchphrase, so-called the 3C framework, that is a cooperate, compete, and confront, has clearly become Washington's key China policy. I wrote a paper on multilateralism in great power politics, whether it's building order or inviting conflict, together with my colleague, the Jeju Park. So we argue that they're based on the core values and ideology of the liberal international order, so-called LIO. Biden is actively advocating a multilateral system centered on allies and like-minded states. The Biden is utilizing multilateralism as a means of containing China by strengthening Asia alliance and partnership in so-called minilateral forms, such as the Quad and AUKUS, to name a few. So the United States intends to form a smaller group composed of so-called reliable states, in particular states that boast strong R&D capabilities and larger economies, especially among democracies at odds with China. So as Liz Howard has mentioned in her brief presentation, quoting the current foreign policy article, the perils of zero-sum thinking in U.S. foreign policy toward China might be a reality by now. Conversely, China tends to emphasize and utilize existing multilateral framework, including the UN and G20. President Xi Jinping criticized the U.S. so-called unilateral approach as selective multilateralism and emphasized the need to pursue a comprehensively multilateralism that builds the so-called community of common destiny for mankind with various stakeholders based on openness and inclusivity. She has vigorously used multilateral diplomacy, ironically, because the multilateralism is usually the term which was created by US and its allies. But now, Xi Jinping is very actively advocate multilateralism diplomacy with the aim of responding to US containing strategy. He has done so far by promoting multilateralism at the regional level with the ultimate goal of realizing the Chinese dream at the global level. Well, the US and China compete and cooperate in the UN multilateral framework at the global level, but they exhibit the more competition and conflict at the regional level in the Indo-Pacific, like in terms of climate change and high-tech hegemony competition. But not surprisingly, the Indo-Pacific region is at the very forefront where these two great powers collide with over their hegemony. But US argue that it must act responsibly with a commitment to uphold the result decided in the multilateral framework. That is, a value and ideology must at least comply with the norm of current framework. So that's why we are just highlighting for the importance of the consolidation of like-minded countries. So in the wake of the China and Russia team up to criticize the US-led unilateral cooperation, and has been internationally increasing its commitment to UN and its multilateral framework. At least on the face of the Indo-Pacific, China appears to be a strong supporter of multilateralism, while the US prefers unilaterals among like-minded states to existing multilateral framework where China and US states compete rather than cooperating. Such a trend is likely to continue as Sino-US hegemonic competition intensified. But here, I think we should be noted that US and its ally should provide support to so-called unlike-minded states in multilateral mechanisms such as RCEP and ASEAN Regional Forum, and etc. Certainly, the bloc of Western democratic countries is consolidate following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, G20 appeared far more divided in response to Russian invasion than it did to the financial crisis of 2008 when they have unitary voices. Consequently, an international order based solely on value-based, like-minded state may appear threatening to non-democratic and neutral countries. Therefore, I think that for the middle powers like Korea and Japan and others, in cooperation with US-led like-minded countries, we must carefully evaluate strategic option between value and national interest, but at the very same time, we have to having a very careful and cautious and deliberate strategies to how to cooperate and persuade unlike-minded countries as well. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shinwa. Professor Shinwari, thank you. Professor Shinwari is my colleague of Korea University, and so I don't want to praise too much her excellency as a scholar, but I think she is one of the best experts on both the traditional and non-traditional security issues, such as human rights and environmental security and human security. Currently, as I introduced, she is appointed as ambassador for international cooperation on North Korean human rights. So I'm really expecting her to do very active works on this field in the near future. Thank you very much, Dr. Shinwari. Then I would like to invite discussants. First discussant is Professor Kim In-han of Ewha Women's University. Please, Dr. Kim.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, I think you can hear me. Good. Thank you for inviting me as a discussant to this forum. It is always great to listen to ideas from scholars, distinguished scholars across the world. So I feel privileged to be part of it here. Let me start from some interesting developments I observed since the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war. Ironically speaking, the war had some positive impact on multilateralism. I noticed that some multilateral institutions are getting stronger. Why? First, they have become a focal point, a useful instrument to form consensus that the war is unjustifiable. And some international multilateral institutions getting stronger. For the two positive impact evidence, example, I think NATO is a perfect example of the point. The West got united under NATO. At the same time, NATO is expanding in terms of membership. For example, the former neutral countries such as Finland applied for the membership to the organization. At the same time, NATO is extending the invitation to countries beyond the European continent. So they want to make a partnership and strengthen a partnership with like-minded countries, such as South Korea and Japan. So we see some kind of the positive developments in terms of the multilateralism across the world after the war. However, the war itself revealed weaknesses. The first one is the war itself showed the critical weakness of the multilateral institutions. Let me go back to the early 1990s. For example, when Ukraine and Russia, they signed a treaty for respecting independence and sovereignty in existing borders. Not just the two signatories, but also other countries were witnesses and provided endorsements to the agreement. But what we see after the 30 years later, what we see is the promises simply got ripped off. And we see the two wars, one in Crimea and another, the invasion in Ukraine. We see the weaknesses of multilateral institutions, multilateralism in terms of the actions against the invasion. Well, the West, at the beginning of the war, the West got together and declared strong sanctions over Russia, against Russia. However, 6 months later, what we have seen so far is all countries on the European continent, they have their own preferences in terms of the degree of enforcement of sanctions and the design of sanctions itself against Russia. which have emboldened Putin more and more. And in terms of the assistance to Ukraine, what we see is the lack of coordination. Many countries provide assistance to Ukraine, ammunitions, medicals, and finance. However, the assistance itself looks like individualistic rather than organized and coordinated. So that being said, we need to look at the United Nations, what it has done to this crisis. Well, when we look back, we see that not much. It is not surprising that Russia is the permanent member of the Security Council in the United Nations, having veto power. So the United Nations is not functioning, and it is disappointing. However, there is one more thing we need to think about. That is, has the United Nations played an important role since the outbreak of the COVID and since the outbreak of the economy disrupted with that pandemic, and now the Ukraine war? We need to raise the question, where has the United Nations been in the midst of many crises sweeping the world? Some say that United Nations is not functioning well, but it is because of the great power rivalry, especially China and the United States. And they argue that what if we start cooperation in transnational issues such as public health and climate change and food insecurity? But the thing is, we still need to raise a question that is it possible? I think the other Liz Howard mentioned that the cooperation is existential. I agree with her. Cooperation among states is important. However, more important question is, cooperation is possible. One example I can give you is when the Biden administration came to power, they said that United States and China, we are competitors, but we are open to cooperation for the transnational issues. But the response from China, it was like a kind of scorn. They were scorning, saying that, well, cooperation on the great power is contingent on, the cooperation on the transnational issues is contingent and dependent on the general trend of the great power politics. So that being said, my question is still, is the cooperation possible and the United Nations can do something about it? This is the questions I want to hear from the speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim In-han. He raised very important, questions. So I want to hear some answers from speakers later on. I'd like to invite the second discussant, Dr. Baek Woo-yeol. Please do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to, bandwagon, Professor Kim In-han's questions, where this multilateralism heading to, and in that sense, no new Cold War has arrived, many say, and South Korea also, feels it, and then Russian invasion to Ukraine, which cannot be justifiable, and as Professor Kim said, and then to Ukraine, only accelerates this new Cold War formation. The separation between politics and economy has been compromised significantly, as we know. As a result, the amalgamation process of these two dimensions, along with the other dimensions such as science and technology, and then political regime, has been accelerated in earnest. As the speakers already mentioned, the multilateralism has been subject to a growing doubt of its effectiveness across all the policy dimensions and across the globe. What we are witnessing in the KIRKA 2022 is the bloc formation or camp formation, roughly 3 camps or blocks, the US-centered, and then China-centered, and hopefully the stuck in between countries-centered. Each camp owns and/or establish enforces its own multilateral, especially unilateral of 3, 4, 5, 10, even 15, across the security dimensions. As we know, the Copenhagen School's approach to expand the range, horizon, and the depth of security, say, military, political regime, and economic, and social, and environmental, and more recently, science, technology, called, security. This complex, amalgamation of these security dimensions also intensifies the conflict between democracy and liberal democracy, just like us, and then authoritarianism, just like China and Russia Federation, as well as people's diverse well-beings. We call it human security. The Ukraine and Russia war, which naturally involves the three aforementioned camps: the U.S. and the U.S. and EU, the Russia and China, and then the those countries which are very capable. Just like South Korea, and then Germany, or the Netherlands, or the Japan, are partially belong to the first two camps. This game is not monotonic. For example, the example of India, and then Turkey, and then Indonesia, Brazil, and probably South Korea shows its complexity. Nevertheless, the most critical political phenomenon from the security point of view, beyond military security, is economic security and science technology security. The two-tiered economic the security structure. One is that of the cutting-edge technologies, as we know, see the semiconductor and batteries, AIs, and big data, on and on and on. Especially and nowadays space. And that of conventional economy, food security, and then energy security. The Russian invasion to Ukraine and ensuing all-out war and accelerates in this economic security, two dimensions at the same time. And it's become a crisis, from every single level of analysis, from the globe, to the individual human security. And then multilateralism is unfortunately again, formulated and enforced along the two camps line. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting last a few days shows that China and Russia team up more tightly, while Central Asian countries and other countries are quite in wary or in cautious manners. The SCO minilateralism, threatens another minilateralism of the West. Another case of multilateral security dilemma, can be applied here. Again, the Ukraine-Russia war accelerated minilateral formation and ensuing competition, mix up and amalgamates every dimensions of security. In particular, raising the status of economic security and the science technology security. And at the same time, dragging international, commons, especially in space, becomes, security matter, a la, space security, and forcing each nation state self-identify themselves in multilateral terms. This is a pretty, stressful, state of nature, I can say. Yes. This is not an ideal development of multilateralism, from the conventional point of view, but it's the reality. We should, give more attention to this new block formulating mini and the multilateralism's negative effects, rather than, or at least simultaneously, the multilateralism's healing functions of growing demands of conflict resolution in Eurasia and in Europe. Last point to make is that the U.S. tries to connect transatlantic and Indo-Pacific regions, from economic and then technological, security point of view first. And this takes a form of minilateral and multilateralism too. And then the Ukraine-Russian war compels the United States and partially the West, to do something more across the globe. And then China and then its authoritarian and then state-oriented camp strongly responds, as we see the SCO gathering last few days, and other minilateral formation, which is unprecedented to China's diplomacy. The UN in this context might be compromised further. A new Cold War has arrived again, where the multilateralism heading to, in a few years, hopefully, this war in Ukraine ends, and we will have a better vision for optimizing the multilateralism to improve the peace and prosperity across the globe. However, it doesn't look promising at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bae-Guyul, for your very solid discussions. And without further ado, I would like to invite the third discussant, Professor Mason Rich. Please.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to thank, obviously, the Jeju Peace Institute for organizing this, the Jeju Self-Governing Province for hosting everyone, also to Keikuns and Professor Lee Shen-hwa, who I will praise as an amazing and excellent scholar and also a really, really hardworking person. And I can't think of anyone better to take on this new role on North Korean human rights. Also Professor Che, or Dr. Che from Azan Institute for all of her hard work as well, and of course all of the staff. So with Russia-Ukraine war, now more than ever, the international order is under systemic threat. But on the other hand, there are also some positives. I think we've heard a few of the speakers point out, pushing back against some of this disintegration. So the question is, where does that leave multilateralism, both in the context of the United Nations and otherwise? And I guess my bottom line up front is that, at present, regardless of how the war comes to an end, the liberal rules-based international order is damaged but not destroyed in terms of security. It's disintegrated but not decoupled in terms of political economy. And it is inadequate but not obsolete in terms of the institutions for non-traditional threats such as disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, and other forms of cooperation. So just briefly to go through those in some way, peace and security damaged but not destroyed. NATO, was seemingly sort of obsolete, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but now is revitalized with a sort of back to the future purpose of, countering Russia, plus its over the horizon cooperation on cybersecurity, counter piracy, and of course, increasingly looking towards the Asia Pacific as an area where it has to have some role as well vis-a-vis China. However, the other multilateral security institutions, are struggling precisely at a time when international cooperation is more necessary than ever because of the threats that we've heard some people refer to already: Yemen, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Libya, the Sahel, non-proliferation threats, etc. The United Nations has seen its primary international security body, the Security Council, reduced in effectiveness due to Sino-US strategic competition, and now especially the poisoned relations between Russia and the West. Condemnations and sanctions for breaches of the peace are subject more than ever to geopoliticized vetoes, as are UNSC referrals to the International Criminal Court for investigations of war crimes and other atrocities. The same is presumably true of UN peacekeeping missions, which are authorized under Chapter 7 and are therefore more difficult to realize because of UN Security Council dysfunction, although perhaps, as we heard Professor Howard point out earlier, this is perhaps an aggravation of a trend that was already ongoing, as much as it was something new. This will also affect non-proliferation insofar as the non-proliferation treaty and the bodies that help to monitor that are also housed underneath the UN in some way. So overall, the Russia-Ukraine war hasn't led the liberal states to abandon the UN. In fact, the UN General Assembly, has continued to be active in pushing back within the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think, Ambassador Shinyo is right that we need to have a more nuanced reading of where the UN is working and not working, rather than simply wholesale saying that it's broken. Looking at international political economy, disintegrated but not decoupled. We're moving away, I think, from free trade and marketization. Leaders have shifted to giving primacy to politics and geostrategy, as Professor Peck just pointed out, over the drive for the efficiency gains of international trade and economic exchange. The Russia-Ukraine war has highlighted the issues of economic security and statecraft, whether that be in terms of energy dependence, vulnerability to financial sanctions, economic isolation, broad economic disruption. And so globally, governments have shifted away from the advantages of trade efficiency and interdependence and towards the perceived imperatives of economic security and resilience. One of the interesting things to look at in this regard is what's going to happen in terms of these mini-lateral and multilateral approaches that are emerging, such as IPEF, the EU's connectivity strategy, the global gateway, and these sort of alternative pathways for global economic cooperation. Those multilateral and in some cases mini-lateral formats have some promise, but right now they're untested. The last thing, cooperation on non-traditional threats, I'll just point out two, I guess, and the first of which is it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the open-ended working group 2021 to 2025 and the proposed program of action at the UN on cybersecurity. That should be something that we should all be very interested in focusing on, but obviously with the poisoned relations between the US and China and the US and Russia, what's going to happen with that working group and what's going to happen with that program of action, I think remains to be seen. And then the last thing is, again, to go back to something that Professor Paik pointed out, the sort of block element that we see emerging has some negatives clearly for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, these other forms of international cooperation for some non-traditional threats and human security related issues. But there's also perhaps some competition between the blocks that might actually lead to some positive developments, perhaps not cooperation, but a race to the top, or at least a race to some type of effectiveness for diplomatic reasons, if not as much as anything else, rather than perhaps a race to the bottom or a complete decoupling or disintegration of this capacity. So I'll just go ahead and stop there. My time is up. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Mason. Dr. Imeyo.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for having me in this wonderful session. My comments focus mainly on the third agenda of this session, which is about the future of liberalism. I think the rise and the fall of liberalism is closely and intrinsically related to the rise and fall of the United States power. I think the most fundamental change in international system after the end of the Cold War is the relatively declining US power. And the reason why multilateralism worked before and why UN operated better than these days and why liberalism brought peace and prosperity around the world, I think is just simply based on the power of the United States. Political liberalization through democratization and economic liberalization through trade, international trade and finance has brought freedom and efficiency to the world. But it seems that this US-China strategy in competition is apparently starting to dismantle what liberalism has built inside and outside of the United States. Definitely, it is very natural for the United States to has to deal with the China's rise, just as the U.S. did to the same Japan basing in 1980s and early 1990s. Having said that, the true change in America's foreign policy towards China began with the election of Trump, the escalation of U.S.-China rivalry into the intense strategic competition. It only happened since Trump was elected as president of the United States. Like it or not, Trump has changed the characteristics of American foreign policy, not to mention of American domestic policy. Even though Trump was defeated in the 2020 election, he's still the most influential Republican political leader who could come back in 2 years. Since the domestic political change of the United States created Trump, the genuine game changer for the future of liberalism, I guess, is American domestic politics. For countries like the United States with hegemonic superpower, their domestic political change directly rectify the course of international politics. Domestic politics of small countries or middle power countries, they are constrained by the international power system. But for the countries at the center of the international power system, their domestic politics can directly facilitate the change in international system, and I believe this is what is happening in international relations right now. The reason that the liberalism as we know it is challenged from both sides, domestically and internationally, is that the initiators of the liberalism, the United States and United Kingdom, they have begun to abandon what they started long ago. From the economic viewpoint, American domestic economy plays a critical role in the fight against liberalism and authoritarianism. The victory of Donald J. Trump in the 2016 presidential election was possible thanks to winning back Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, which had a significant portion of Rust Belt. In the 2016 election, Trump gained votes by more than 10% among voters with non-college degrees in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. These are a group of people who have been hurt due to the neoliberal globalization. For this group of people, there has been no trickle-down effect that neoliberalism has promised. So my question, I think, goes to Professor Howard. My question is, since this, the future of liberalism is basically hugely depends on the power of the United States or the characteristic of American foreign policy, what if Democrats lose hugely in the coming midterm election or Trump come back in the presidential election in 2 years? The liberalism in American society will be challenged further, which will lead to the more losing of liberal agendas in American foreign policy. What do you think the American domestic political changes will affect the future of liberalism or democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Im Hae-ryong. Final discussant is Dr. Choi-mi. Please do.
네, 제가 잠시 고민을 했는데 to save your time, I just decided I give you a question, skipping my comments. I'm a researcher, but I myself took part in the multilateral cooperation or regional cooperation, and I understand that this is a very difficult concept and ideal concept. And I am personally skeptic about this multilateral cooperation, but I don't want to negate the value of this. I know that this is the right direction to go, but I think we have to think about what we can do and what we cannot do, and what are practical things that we can actually do, and set appropriate goals. In that regard, when we do multilateral cooperation, to what extent do we reach in order for us to be able to say that we have conducted multilateral cooperation? And one of the speakers said that we have to create a legally binding document, but sometimes even after we come up with legally binding documents, they just come of no use. In that case, what should we do? And we also have multilateral institutions and systems already in place. Then what should we do more?
As I understand that her questions is related to the fundamental problems of multilateralism. We have only 2 minutes left. My initial plan was to open the floor and get some, questions and comments from the floor. But unfortunately, I can do that because of the time limits. We do have almost 40 audiences here. Thank you very much for attending this conference. But I do give some minutes to speakers for their answers and comments on the questions raised in the presentation and discussions. First, I'd like to Ambassador Shinyo for answers and comments. Ambassador Shinyo, please do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am delighted to say only a few words. Namely, I think there was a discussions whether multilateralism or minilateralism, or minilateralism does not function pretty well, or even contradictory to the multilateralism. But I would like to say that the United Nations is not omnipotent. United Nations, is very limited in its power. And if you only, ask the United Nations to play an important role, it is bound to fail. So we need to, utilize the regional organizations or major powers which are able to contribute to the solution of the problem, be it military, be it economically, And so that I think we have to utilize and motivate the main powers or multilateral settings in accordance with the Charter principle and Charter of the United Nations. Regional, organizations is in one chapter enshrined in Chapter 8. The facet. My last point is that we should use more the General Assembly rather than the Security Council. If the Security Council is not able to function, we should transfer issues to the General Assembly, based on the, resolution, Uniting for Peace resolution and so on and so forth. So I think the middle power and also the smaller powers must use more the General Assembly or maybe ECOSOC, because I think such problem like SDGs, climate change, poverty reduction, all those issues do need the multilateral cooperation, and in the field of in the forum like the General Assembly or ECOSOC, not in the Security Council. So this is my facet. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Howard.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you again so much for the opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear.
Yes.
Great, okay. Thank you so much to the Jeju Forum and to your sponsors and to my fellow panelists today. We had two questions, one about the future of liberalism depending on the United States, and what if the Democrats lose the next elections, and then of course, is cooperation possible, and what is multilateralism good for? Lots of questions. We could probably take the rest of the day trying to answer those. I should say that I'm speaking here not in my capacity necessarily as the president of ACUNS. The Academic Council on the UN System does not take positions on matters. So I'm speaking with my hat as a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. And I'm also now serving as a senior fellow at the US Institute of Peace, which is funded by the US Congress. So as I said before, we live in a 50-50 world. The United States is a 50-50 country also. I think we could go either way. Actually, we have a minority of people in the country who do not believe in democracy. And so at the end of the day, most Americans believe in democracy, and I have to think most Republicans also believe in democracy, even though we have a very popular former president who diverges from the traditional conservative Republican line. So yes, things could go either way. And in these moments where the world hangs in the balance, it is up to individuals to have the courage to speak out for the things that you know are right, even if it seems like it might be very difficult or even impossible sometimes. I have to believe that we have hope for the future, that we owe it to ourselves and our children and our grandchildren to continue to at least try to uphold the values that all states profess to hold, that is of sovereignty and non-intervention, and a belief that we want to survive, which means cooperation on a number of issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Well, time is already up, but before winding up, I'd like to thank excellent participants of this conference, organizers of this meeting, and mostly the audiences for their participation. Thank you very much.